to move away from a coin-based, outdated system? Well, here's the thing, Mr. President. Here's the thing. One of the reasons the Tasmanian government has been able to say very regularly over the years that Tasmania has lower per capita losses on poker machines than other states, it's because we have a coin-based system, Mr. President. It's actually a protective factor in this state. So any move to step away from our coin-based system should be absolutely rigorously indicated by evidence that it would be a step towards greater harm reduction rather than towards vulnerability to more harm. That's not what this is going to do, Mr. President, this TITO proposal. So the TITO proposal apparently would work in this basic way. Customers would purchase a ticket with money loaded onto it. They use it on the poker machine and they get a ticket from the machine with their balance, which they can then take to another machine or to cash in at a cashier. The government intends to introduce this system that would allow $200 to be loaded onto a ticket and would allow for $100 to be able to be loaded from the ticket onto the poker machine at a time. The announcement is that it lacks any other detail virtually to properly explain how the proposed system would work. But what we could guess and surmise, it is likely to operate similarly to what it does in some other jurisdictions, likely to operate through a vending machine. That's most commonly in use elsewhere. So it's not going to be you have to go to a counter to buy a ticket from a person, which, by the way, Mr. President, would be a more protective factor over any system because interacting with a human in this whole process is building in a potential protective factor. But doing things entirely through a machine, not necessarily doing that. The policy is silent on whether people would be able to buy more than one ticket at a time, or whether there'd be any limit on the tickets purchased in a day, for example. If there were limits on tickets purchased, if that was imposed through this policy, there's no indication of how that would be monitored and enforced, how the system would practically work to enforce a limit. So with no human oversight and no limit on how many tickets can be purchased, a TITO system can easily be used for money laundering, as it has been in other states with similar systems. It can easily feed a pokies addiction very readily for people who are highly vulnerable. It's much more dangerous potentially than a coin-based system, and it's not something that the Liquor and Gaming Commission have advised. And I would guess, Mr. President, perhaps the government deliberately didn't seek advice from the Gaming Commission because they knew exactly what the Gaming Commission would say to them about this and other measures that have ended up on this proposed list of measures from the government. This is not a well-indicated system. Just because we're following other states on this is not something to pat ourselves on the back about or congratulate ourselves. These are other states that have higher per capita losses. These are other states that have far greater money laundering risks. These are other states that have higher levels of harm than we have here. This is looking potentially to be stripping away protections we've had in place here under our system that are legacy protections. They're not perfect, Mr. President. I would like to see them absolutely updated with something proper like the nation-leading player card with loss limits program, which is exactly what evidence-based tells us is the best outcome for our state. We shouldn't be updating our system that puts us into a space of greater risk. The Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation research shows that cashless gambling, such as a TITO system, increases losses and therefore increases risk of harm unless it's accompanied by mandatory pre-commitment or loss limits. The Treasurer says in answers to my questions on notice after the briefing this, and I'll quote, "In relation to ticket-in, ticket-out systems, TITO, it is a point of fact that Tasmania is the only jurisdiction in the country that has not moved away from EGM use by coin only in hotels and clubs. It's proven technology in use across the country. Its introduction will allow for the modernisation of gaming systems in place in Tasmania and will go hand in hand with the use of ticket value limits and improved controls on access to cash through FRT, facial recognition technology, Mr. President, ensuring that TITO supports the overall harm minimisation framework." Absolute rubbish. There's nothing to support any of that. Literally nothing. The fact that Tasmania is the only jurisdiction in the country that has not moved away from coins is, as I've said, perfectly reasonable and has been a protective factor. This technology is proven technology in use across the country. It's proven to be delivering jurisdictions that have higher levels of Pokies harm, that have a higher risk of money laundering. Its introduction will not allow for the modernisation of gaming systems. It will allow us to sink into the pit of greater harm that other jurisdictions are already experiencing. And it's astonishing to me that there can be any claim that a TITO system supports overall harm minimisation frameworks. It doesn't. And the Gaming Commission would tell us that, and any evidence base would tell us that. The government just hasn't taken the time and has deliberately chosen not to go to the effort of creating an evidence base that supports these measures and looking for one in order to justify them with a rationale. There is no rationale. The TITO policy, as announced, would be a major change for Tasmania towards a cashless system, but it has no pre-commitment or loss limit features, and evidence is very clear that this will drive higher losses and greater harm. The Treasurer cannot pretend that limiting the amount you can load onto a machine is in any way equitable or comparable to having a programmed loss limit. That is simply not the case. And if there's no limit on the number of tickets I can literally go to the vending machine and get myself $5, $10, $200 worth of tickets, $1,000, $2,000. I can get those, and I can go and sit down at machines and I can start using them. And yes, I might have to load on again after I've used my first $100, but there's nothing stopping me. There's nothing stopping me then going through all of those tickets and losing all of that money in one go. There is nothing remotely comparable when it comes to harm minimisation in what the Treasurer is proposing with this TITO system and what would be delivered under a player card with programmed loss limits. The Treasurer claims, in answers to my questions I noticed after the briefing, this, and I quote, "The introduction of TITO must be viewed in the context of the full suite of measures, which includes limits on the value of tickets, improved controls on access to cash and clearer oversight from the Liquor and Gaming Commission, ensure that the introduction of TITO occurs within a strong harm minimisation framework." Again, Mr President, utter rubbish. Just rubbish. We do not have a strong harm minimisation framework. We've had one of the strongest in the country and that's protected us, but here we are eroding it. Here we are deliberately turning our back on it. The introduction of TITO erodes features of our harm minimisation system, paltry though it is, but we do have in place in Tasmania. The government's unable to provide any evidence or modelling demonstrating the impact of introducing this TITO. They haven't modelled it. They don't know what to expect as an impact. Maybe it's the vibe of the thing. Again, Mr President. It's nonsense to point to clearer oversight from the Liquor and Gaming Commission, which the Treasurer does there in his answer to my question. Apparently this will deliver clearer oversight. How? There's absolutely no evidence to back that up. And if so, what clearer oversight of what specifically, and what exactly is the impact that will deliver? How exactly will that be linked to a harm reduction? None of that. None of that policy work or evidence base has been presented, Mr President, because it hasn't been done. And by the way, they are using the Liquor and Gaming Commission's name in vain there, I think, since they haven't even asked the Commission about the role that it will play in that. We knew that they hadn't asked them about it, certainly in developing and deciding on these measures. Let's be really clear. The Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission is an independent statutory entity in that sense, but it has to do what it's told, basically. It works within very narrow parameters imposed on it by our legislation and by government policy directives that are given to it. So when the Treasurer says, in answers to my questions taken on notice, the Commission, who are required to foster responsible gambling behaviour, will have a significant role in making implementation decisions regarding TITO and the use of FRT in venues. Well, that's only dependent on the government giving them a direction with the scope and empowered to do that. If the government doesn't give them a direction that's appropriately configured to give them the freedom and availability to independently do that, then they're constrained from doing it. And what we'll get is a commission having to, within parameters provided by government, design this system. It's absolutely nonsense to pretend that they're going to have free rein, the commission that is, Mr President, going to have free rein to go and make this some whiz-bang great dinky-die system. The Commission have already made it patently clear, again and again, that in their view, it is a player card with programmed loss limits that is the right system for this state that they spent a number of years developing and had on the verge of being implemented. Mr. President, experts confirm that our current coin-based system has a far lower risk of money laundering, and a player card with loss limits has zero risk of money laundering, zero. So while the Treasurer says in answer to my questions taken on notice, while no government position has been taken at this stage on data handling or ticket validity, operational decisions on TITO will be determined by the Commission, including controls that address money laundering risks. Well, the Commission, if asked, I believe, would readily tell government the best way to remove money laundering risks entirely is to introduce the developed player card with programmed loss limits, Mr. President. They've been very clear that that's an absolute rock-solid benefit of a player card. If Tasmania is to move to a cashless system for pokies, the player card system is vastly superior to a TITO system, both for harm minimisation and for money laundering risk. Mr. President, the current cap on electronic gaming machines for hotels and clubs is 2,350. The number of machines currently installed sits at 2,274. That was at 30 June 2025. So that brings us to the next measure the government are proposing, which is the setting of new caps statewide on poker machine numbers. The government is allowing hotels and clubs until 30 June this year to apply for licences to reach the cap, because we've been under the cap the entire time we've had a cap, Mr. President. And after the 30th of June this year, a new cap will be set at whatever the number of machines installed at that time is in the state. Fair enough, Mr. President. No worries. We've never hit the cap anyway. By all means, let's make the cap whatever the number of machines are on 30 June this year. They then say the cap may then gradually reduce over time, because as venues potentially relinquish their machines, with every second machine relinquished, that will be removed from the available pool of machines, and over time, incrementally, that may well reduce the cap of machines. Mr. President, it's important to note here, it's really important to note that this is another measure that the government is saying they expect to deliver harm minimisation results. And they have absolutely, literally no reason on which to expect that. There is no evidence to tell them that marginally reducing the cap we currently have on machines will have any tangible impact on harm, on pokies losses, and on the impact of pokies in the state. It's important to note less machines do not necessarily mean fewer losses or less harm. There is not a simple relationship between the number of machines and pokies losses. It's simplistic to talk about natural attrition of machine numbers as harm minimisation. It simply isn't. Especially not if it is only very, very small reductions, which is most likely under this measure. It's fine. There's no reason not to do it, Mr. President. By all means, let's lower our cap to the number of machines we have on the 30 June. And if over time we have marginal decreases in the number of machines as machines may be relinquished and we take every second one of those out of the pool, great. No reason not to do that. But there's zero evidence to support that being described as harm minimisation. Zero evidence to say that that will impact on the level of losses in our state. One of the ways we know that, Mr. President, and I put this in the briefing paper I provided to members, is that we can look at the number of poker machines in the state and just look potentially at the change in number of machines, for example, from 2019 to 2025, and see that across that time, from 2019 to 2025, when it comes to pokies in hotels and clubs, there are fewer venues with pokies for a start, and there are fewer machines between 2019 and 2025, and losses went up in that time in terms of just raw numbers. Same for in casinos. Across the years from 2019 to 2025, fewer machines in casinos, and yet losses go up in raw numbers. It's quite a dramatic increase, actually, in casinos. But that's the thing, Mr. President. There is no actual discernible correlation between losses and harm and the number of machines when we're only talking about potentially small changes, even so. So again, No evidence there. It must be the vibe of the thing. Certainly sounds good. Less machines on the face of it just sounds great. And if you know nothing about the topic, and let's face it, Mr President, given that the Cabinet didn't receive any advice or policy work on this from its Liquor and Gaming Commission, from the Commission and the commissioners that are experts in this, and the independent experts under legislation tasked with providing policy advice to the government, given the Cabinet didn't seek their advice, maybe all they had to go on was the vibe of the thing, and on the face of it, it seemed like a sensible measure. Well, it won't hurt, Mr President, but there's no way they can say it's going to help. Moving on, Mr President, to another measure announced, and that's the introduction of immediate self-exclusion available in venues via QR code and facial recognition technology as part of the exclusion scheme system. Mr President, this has been previously announced, so it's not a new measure that was announced in January 2026, but it was a reiteration of a previously announced measure. The introduction of self-exclusion system for poker machines is really an update on the current system we have, and by all means we should be looking to update our exclusion system. This would have customers using a QR code in venues to put themselves onto the exclusion register quite promptly, which may well be a good thing. It does take a few steps currently, and that could definitely be improved. The person would be entered onto a database, and that would be linked to new mandatory facial recognition technology which would identify excluded customers if they entered a gaming room. Exclusion mechanisms, Mr President, let's be really clear, just for background, exclusion mechanisms are an important part of customer protection from poker machine harm, for sure, but they largely rely on customers acknowledging they have a problem and deciding to take action themselves. And just for clarity there, because we've got a lot of really strong evidence on this from many, many years of research, evidence tells us that only about 1 in 10 people with an addiction to poker machines seeks help for that addiction. So only about 1 in 10 are at the point that they are identifying they've got a problem and need to seek help. And it's only a small subset of those people, those 1 in 10, who participate then in exclusion schemes. So, Mr President, it's important to note that exclusion schemes are a marginal aspect of protecting people at a time of extremity, basically, in their struggling with an addiction to poker machines. The other thing I point out here, Mr President, is it's really important to note this. A player card, programmed loss limits, a player card, though, also functions in and of itself as an exclusion scheme. Don't have to have a separate system. A player card provides an exclusion scheme because an excluded person's card is simply deactivated. And as ID is required to set up a new card, they're not able to get a new card while they're excluded because they're in the system. So we have a gold standard, absolutely expert recommended way to operate a highly effective exclusion scheme without the need for facial recognition technology and without the need for extra measures, all built into a player card. In the absence of a player card, a better functioning exclusion scheme is worthwhile to invest in, but in terms of minimising poking's harm, as stated by the Gaming Commission, it will only be of marginal impact. Exclusion schemes, as I said, apply to those at the extremity of an addiction. Let's be really clear. Exclusion schemes don't prevent harm. Exclusion schemes don't prevent the development of an addiction. All they do is provide some better help to people who are at the extremity of things. In 30th of June 2025, there were 392 people in Tasmania in our exclusion scheme. With such a major focus on the exclusion system for harm minimisation outcomes, rather than a system-wide measure such as a player card with loss limits, the government is basically guaranteeing in that binary choice to go with an exclusion scheme with facial recognition technology instead of a player card with loss limits. They are guaranteeing that thousands of Tasmanians who use poker machines will miss out on consumer protections and empowerment that would be provided by the card, and will only be providing marginal support to people who are already at the extremity of being harmed. It's absolutely the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, Mr. President. And even then, it's only picking up the people who are on death's door, not the people who maybe just have a few broken limbs. It's not the fence at the top of the cliff, which is exactly what the card would be. It's interesting because the Deloitte report, and I point members to page 35 of the Deloitte report because it summarises that the fact that gambling harm is not restricted only to problem gamblers or people at that very extreme end of an addiction. It references fairly recent Victorian study which found that 85% of gambling harm was attributed to low risk and moderate risk gamblers. And it's definitely not likely that those people would be at the extremity of their addiction and using an exclusion scheme. So 85% of gambling harm is not going to be touched at all by an exclusion scheme tweaking and upgrading and adding facial recognition technology. It's not going to help it at all. And just to be clarifying too about some terms I just used there, Mr. President, when I talked about low risk or moderate risk gamblers, those terms don't mean that the risk is low for people who are in low risk categories. It means that they are already exhibiting signs of harmful gambling behaviour. They're already into the lowest of the risk categories, what that means. And then there is a moderate, a category that is where people are at the moderate risk category, and then there is a problem gambler category above that. But there is harm occurring across all of those. 85% of it is in the low and moderate categories. When I asked the government through the briefing and in questions on notice if they would commit to an independent evaluation of the new Tasmanian Gambling Exclusion Scheme and the facial recognition technology system at some period after implementation, the answer was no. No, not interested to see how it's going to work out, Mr. President, not interested to track how effective it may have been or may not have been. The answer provided to me pointed instead to the fact that we have our periodic social and economic impact study of gambling in Tasmania, our SEIS, which is a valuable broad piece of research that is done here. Used to be every 3 years, now it's every 5. But our SEIS will not function as an evaluation or a review of the new exclusion scheme system and FRT system that they're developing. That should be and would be required to be reviewed and evaluated separately and with a particular term of reference to make sure that we're actually measuring what impact, if any, that's having. Surely if we're putting this new system in place, we would want to know how it's going and we'd probably want to look ahead and know whether we can improve it further. But no, Mr. President, not intended. Mr. President, it's worth mentioning here, and members may or may not be aware of this, but the pokies industry here in Tassie is already using facial recognition technology for monitoring exclusion in some venues. The Commission hasn't approved the current system because it isn't within rules that are currently available under our system. But the government states that if there's nothing that they're doing that doesn't comply with current rules, then it's allowable. The problem is that there are no rules specific to facial recognition technology use in pokies venues currently, so there's no real guide on what is being done and what impact it might have. I did ask at my briefing, has anyone checked whether the current use of facial recognition technology by pokies venues in Tasmania complies with privacy laws? And the answer is not that the government is aware of. No one's checked that. I asked who would check whether the use complies with current privacy laws, and there was no firm answer there either. We're not really sure who would check that, Mr. President. So currently we've got an experimental use of facial recognition technology in pokies venues in this state with no rules guiding it, no one checking on whether it's complying with current privacy laws. We're apparently modelling that around a South Australian approach, but I asked how many venues do we know of that are actually currently using this? Don't really know for sure, maybe 20-ish. But I've also heard from other sources that it's maybe as many as half the venues in our state doing that. It's not known, Mr. President. I asked for a description of what the current use was for facial recognition technology in venues, and here's the way it was described to me was like this. Gaming rooms have 2 entryways, each has a camera on it, so that people, when they walk through into the gaming area through either entryway, are scanned by the camera. If that person is on that venue's internal exclusion register, because that's the one that they're linking it to at the moment, if that person is on that register and they walk past the camera, it scans their face and they're flagged by the system, and then there's a flashing light and an alarm that sounds, probably in the area of the coin operator where the staffing member would be. Mr. President, I was quite shocked to hear this description of what's currently in use in venues, that there is a scanning of someone as they enter a venue and then an alarm and a flashing light go off. To me, that system, which is in place currently with no rules around it, no design features that have been informed by our Gaming Commission, that system has the real potential to cause trauma, to cause shame, to cause further harm to the excluded person who might be involved. And remember, there is literally no oversight or monitoring of that current system because it doesn't really exist within our current rules.
Through you, Mr. President, I would respectfully ask the honourable member if you would...
Thank you. I'll finish this little section, and then before I move on to a next section, I'll pull up stumps then. So, Mr. President, the other thing that disturbs me about the fact that we are currently using completely unregulated facial recognition technology in our venues and are proposing to build it into a system of exclusion. The thing that bothers me about that even more is that we have businesses such as casinos and hardware chains and other retail chains who have been found to use facial recognition technology for marketing purposes in their venues. And there's already been a landmark decision in 2024 from the National Privacy Commissioner about the use of facial recognition technology in a large retail outlet, with questions raised about invasion of privacy and about civil liberties. So the government's announced policy on facial recognition technology, just to be really clear, and I did ask this, does not prohibit or constrain venues from using facial recognition technology installed as part of the exclusion scheme for other purposes, such as marketing. There's no rules about that at the moment, and it's not necessarily anticipated there will be. It's a big question mark that hangs over it. So, Mr. President, before I move on to the last few areas that I've got to discuss around the government's measures, noting the time, can I move to adjourn the debate?
Question.